All right, be on your best, most articulate behavior now. And again, I'm recording it so you can have a house party on Saturday and play it for your family, or you can look at it next time, or your other students who can't make this meeting time will be able to look at it. Okay? So today we're going to be dealing with this question here. Where is it? 999, scroll up. The big question. What strikes you about the Spanish invasion of central Mexico? Okay, it's question number 4 on assignment 1. Let me move your faces over there. We're going to talk, you're going to meet Hernan Cortez. You're going to meet Gonzalo Guerrero. You're going to meet some Tlaxcalans. And you're going to meet the woman who led a very interesting life, Malintzin, who later became baptized as Doña Marina. Has anybody ever heard of Malintzin in your young lives so far?
In my history class, I think they called her La Malinche.
La Malinche, all right. So one of y'all have heard of her. La Malinche is not a nice thing to call her, right? Folks no longer call her that. She's also known as La Chingada. That's another very bad word in Spanish. So historically, she's been interpreted in very negative ways. So we're going to unpack her role in the invasion a bit. Okay. So in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it was this monumental coming together of peoples who had been separated for at least 10,000 years, right? People living in this hemisphere, right, were separated biologically, culturally, and in every way from folks in this hemisphere for at least 10,000 years. And that had monumental consequences when it came to this Columbian exchange, this exchange of peoples and ideas and animals, flora and fauna. Okay, this is the area of the world we're going to be focusing on right now, the Caribbean Basin and Central Mexico. Y'all might have heard of Hernan Cortez. Does he ring a bell? And have y'all learned about him at all? Rachel, what do you remember about Mr. Cortez?
I know he was involved with the invasion of Central America.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Especially if you read his narrative about it, it was all because of his wonderful diplomacy and military prowess, right? Most of the history that has been taught about the conquest of Mexico came from the conquerors themselves. Like the old saying goes, the winners write history. So I'm recently reading this excellent book by Matthew Restall, When Montezuma Met Cortez, and it's really changing the way not only myself, but other historians view the whole conquest, and I've incorporated some of his ideas into this lecture. So indeed, Cortez was one of the main leaders, not the only one, of the Spanish invasion of the Mexica, and this was his expedition. His expedition was made up of about 500 soldiers, 6 African slaves, 11 ships, sailors, cannon, horses. Falconets are guns that are on a little turret like this. They're not falcons or anything. And then dogs of war, greyhounds, canary, and English mastiffs. So this was definitely a military expedition, right? There's no women on board, no botanists like we saw with, like Columbus brought on his second mission. So Hernan Cortez had come from Extremadura, which is this part of Spain where many explorers and conquistadors came from. And he had lived in the Caribbean, specifically in what is today Cuba, for 15 years. He had lived in Cuba, and the Spanish had plied the Caribbean Ocean looking for gold and planting sugar. But after 15 years, he was done with it. He wanted to, rumors had been circulating throughout the Spanish Caribbean about this fabled city of gold somewhere over here. And Spanish authorities were much more conservative than he was. So he just said, you know what, I'm going to gather some men and take off. Historians argue whether or not he had the thumbs up from the Spanish governor at the time or not. But nevertheless, he left Santiago de Cuba right down here. and then resupplied here in the Yucatan. The resupply in the Yucatan was a normal thing at the time for Spaniards to do as they plied the waters of the Gulf. When they hit the resupply place in the Yucatan, they met up with a Maya chief. The Maya-speaking peoples live in this area here. He met up with a Maya chief they had been doing business with. However, this time he came across Geronimo Aguilar. He was a Maya slave. He was a slave of the Maya. And what had happened was 8 years before, a Spanish ship had wrecked off the shallow coral reefs of the Yucatan. This is one of many, many Spanish ships to have wrecked in the Yucatan, whether it was from shallow reefs or hurricanes or what have you. So Cortez said, wow, a Spaniard, he can be really helpful on the expedition. And Cortez bought the Spaniard from his Maya owner. What might Geronimo Aguilar, how might he help the Spanish expedition into Mexico? Why might have Cortez have valued finding this enslaved Spaniard? What do y'all think? And again, I stopped because I just get sick of hearing my voice without hearing you all. Go ahead, I interrupted somebody.
Would he have probably known the language?
Yeah, he knows the language and the customs. Exactly, exactly.
A bit of the area around there at least.
I'm sorry?
Probably a bit of the area around there at least.
Yes, indeed. And even though the Maya is different than Nahua, many Nahua people also spoke Maya. So he'd be able to speak Maya to the people here, the Nahuatl speaking people, and they would be bilingual enough, and then Aguilar. So he had himself a translator. Okay, I'm sorry, an interpreter. Translators do things with words on the paper, interpreters do them verbally. However, before they took off, Geronimo Aguilar said, Cortez, you think, right, you rocked at finding me. There's this guy who lives inland called Gonzalo Guerrero. He lives inland with his family, his wife Zazil and kids. Mestizaje, right, is a mixed family. And he's become a Maya chief, a cacique is the word for it. And if you get him on board, he is a Maya leader. You're going to have a lot of allies. If you can talk him into joining you, he's a Maya chief and warrior, and he would be a big, big help. So Cortez sends a messenger inland to the Yucatan to go try to get in contact with Guerrero. Okay. What do you think Guerrero's response back to Cortez's messenger was? Take a guess. Justin, Rachel, Lee, or Monique? So Cortez's messenger comes in and says, hey, come join us. We're going to go conquer the Aztecs. What do you think, Monique? Can I pick on you?
I'm going to guess that he turned Cortez down.
Yeah, he did it in a very diplomatic way. He said, thank you, give my regards, and may God bless Cortez and the King and Queen of Spain. And here's some gifts for you. And Cortez's messenger gave he and his family gifts. But he said, but can you please go now? And his wife, Zazil, and it's too bad, this statue in current day Akumal, Yucatan, shows her prostrate behind him making tortillas. But what little we know about her, Zazil stood up and told Cortez's messenger, and if you come back, we will make war on you. Yep, so they took off without Gonzalo Guerrero, and sure enough, the body of Gonzalo Guerrero was discovered 20 years later after a battle between other Spanish forces and the Maya. So for 20 years after this, Gonzalo Guerrero fought off the Spanish incursions into the Yucatan. And interestingly, today he is commemorated in a public statue in the public square in Akumal in the Yucatan. Isn't that interesting? All right. So now, after stopping there with Geronimo Aguilar, they're off to Mexico. They land in Veracruz. Veracruz literally means where you can see the cross. They land in Veracruz, and then they're going to head into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. because they've heard about this fabled, wealthy, gilded city of Tenochtitlan, and they heard a lot about the leader Montezuma, how he had this huge aviary, how he was super rich, and the Spaniards wanted part of it. More on Montezuma and his family in the lecture about Doña Isabella. So Montezuma's spies see the ships come, and this is an actual 15th century drawing done by Mexica people of the ships a coming. It's not like done by my little nephew. So here's the Aztec spy going, Spanish, they're fishing. So Montezuma's people offered the Spanish gifts of food, girls, gold, and then say, now can you please leave? Do you think, what do you think the Spanish said to that offer of food, gold, and girls? Let me pick on you. What do you think, Rachel?
I doubt they would take that. My understanding of the Spanish is they were there for more than just a little bit of gold. And if they had gold, they would want to find out where they got the gold so they could get more gold.
Yep. Are you all in agreement? Yeah, this just teased the Spanish. Nor did the Spanish say, no thanks, we're not in the girl trafficking market, right? We don't want any of your Nahua women. That's not very Christian. Nope, there's no evidence that any Spaniard ever said, no thank you, right? So the Spanish brought in, as Rachel said, they accepted the gifts, the food, the gold, and the girls. And when I say girls, I literally mean, women in their teens, young women in their teens. One of the women that was gifted, and this is one of the questions I ask you, one of the women that was gifted to Cortez and the whole expedition went by the name of Malintzin, right? And Lee remembers her being referred to as Malinche, right? That's the other word you might see associated with her. She grew up speaking Nahua, and she was the eldest sibling in her family. So she was going to be the one who inherits the family wealth. But it turns out one of her half younger brothers was jealous of Malintzin, and her half younger brother talked mom into selling Malintzin into slavery. And they did. So Malintzin's mom sold her to the Maya into slavery. So in her years of life with the Maya, she was now able to speak Maya and Nahua. And when I say sold into slavery, don't think of it like the US South in the 1830s in a whipping post. Not that chattel slavery that might come to mind, but it was more like a domestic servant who would pretty soon be incorporated into the family. But nevertheless, she was sold to another family. When she was gifted to Cortez and the Spanish, she was baptized, right, and renamed Doña Marina. What does Doña mean in Spanish? Does anybody know? What does Doña refer to? Go ahead and have a Google off if you want to. Emma, do you know what the term Doña means?
No, I don't know.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, you're not expected to know Spanish. It means like madame. It's a very, what is it, madame? It's a term given not to everybody, right? Like somebody in powers, or like my grandma, we'd call her Doña, right? The First Lady of the United States, you call her Doña. So she's given a very powerful name, Doña Marina. And guess what? 9 months later, she had, quote unquote, the first symbolic Mexican, right? Cortez was the dad, Doña Marina was the mother, and the first, I don't want to say the first Mexican was born, but the first, one of the early mestizos was born. His name was Martin Cortez. Okay. By the way, Cortez and Malintzin did not get married. We have no idea if it was consensual sex, but you can imagine who was in the position of power, right? It was Cortez and all his crew. Back to Doña Marina later. So this is the Spanish route from Veracruz, inland, inland, inland. They're gonna pass these cities, pass by these big volcanoes we talked about last time, Popocatépetl and Itza, and then head into the Aztec heartland, right? The Aztec capital right there of Tenochtitlan. You know, it's not on that's so on purpose. 300 years later, when during the US-Mexican War, the US Marines went on this same route inland, right? On purpose. General Winfield Scott said, you know what? We're gonna conquer the Mexicans just like Cortez conquered the Mexica. So the US on purpose these Marines took the same route. You know that, what's that song that goes from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli? You know that song? Yeah, it's the Marine fight song or the Marine song. This is why they say from the halls of Montezuma. Montezuma's halls right here. Back to the past. So now the Marina, Doña Marina was the interpreter. And it's not hard to, well, it's hard to underestimate, it's hard to overestimate the importance Malintzin had. Look here's an old 16th century drawing of her being the interpreter between tiny Cortez and tiny Montezuma. Most of the drawings we have from the period show her being right in the middle, right? In fact, the Mexica people ended up calling her La Lengua, the tongue, the translator. And here she is translating for him. So she became very, very important. And along the way, the Spanish, here's Cortez's enslaved African named Juan. So along the way, Doña Marina and Cortez made locals a deal. They said, hey, you all help us with the Mexica and you will benefit. Because remember, the Aztecs made a lot of enemies in the expansion of their empire. So there was many, many local folks willing to ally themselves with the Spanish. And what happens if you were a local folk and you didn't take the deal Cortez has given you? What do you think happened?
Probably nothing great.
Yeah, remember the dog thing? Dogs, right? Like the old Godfather movie, they made him a deal they couldn't refuse, right? So you got deal or dogs. And here's Doña Marina, and here they are unleashing the dogs. Yikes. So as they roll in from down here in Veracruz, they're passing by Tlaxcala. And do you remember who are the Tlaxcalans from last week? Do y'all remember who they were? That funny named folks. Who are the Tlaxcalans? Emma, Justin, Rachel, Monique, or Lee? Remember that name? No?
They were just like the people that didn't want any immigrants coming south, right?
Yeah, they didn't want anything to do with the Aztecs, right? Because the Tlaxcalans were the #1 enemy of the Mexica, right? So when the Mexica went on the warpath and captured a few Tlaxcalans, it was the Tlaxcalan leadership that was brought to the top of the Pyramid of the Sun and had his rib cage opened and his ritualistically sacrificed. So the Tlaxcalans are the #1 enemies of the Mexica. So this is an actual painting from the time as well. So when the Tlaxcalan chief meet Cortez with Doña Marina down here interpreting, the Tlaxcalans say, oh, heck yeah, we'll join you to go kick butt on our public enemy #1. Here's another image from the time. So now the Spanish and their 500 soldiers have tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors marching with the Spanish. The Spanish did say you have to convert to Christianity before you can join us, and the Tlaxcalan leadership said, oh, sure, we'll add Jesus to our many other gods, that's fine, not a big deal. So once again, the importance of Doña Marina. She's center in all these images of the early conquest period. And here's Cortez making a deal with Tlaxcalans or vice versa. One of the interesting things that really hit home to me reading this book over the summer break was that many historians now are looking at the Spanish conquest of the Mexica more as a Mexican Civil War in which the Spanish just were on one side of it, right? So they helped the Tlaxcalans whoop the Mexica. And as you all are going to see in chapter 4 of, let me share the screen again. As you all are going to see in chapter 4 of the Alan Taylor book, the chapter you're going to read, the Tlaxcalans are even going to be part of the Spanish expeditions into New Mexico and the settling of Santa Fe and Albuquerque, right? They're going to be allied with the Spanish for hundreds of years to come. So now the Tlaxcalans, tens of thousands of Tlaxcalans and the Spanish arrive in Cholula. Have you all heard the word Cholula before? That word must ring a bell, especially during lunchtime. All right, what's Cholula?
Hot sauce.
Hot sauce. You know that little yellow bottle of hot sauce? So next time you look at the yellow bottle of hot sauce, look at the little pyramid at the top, right? There's going to be a pyramid, and that is capturing the glyph for Cholula. See, here's Cholula, there's the pyramid. So they're borrowing the Aztec pictograph of what Cholula is and put it on hot sauce. So here's the little pyramid. In Cholula, the Spanish are welcomed in initially, but then they get intel from Doña Marina saying like, wow, the Aztecs are going to come tonight and wipe you all out. Whether historians still argue about whether or not that actually was going to happen. So the Spanish had a preemptive attack on the Cholulans and ended up massacring everybody in the town. Men, women, and children in Cholula were massacred. That is not on the little hot sauce bottle, I don't think. So we should call up the Cholula people. Just by looking at this image, who's fighting who in this invasion of the Mexica? Rachel, can you see who's fighting who?
It looks like, it doesn't look like the Spanish are fighting.
Yeah, you have one Spanish guy way back here going like, and then maybe you have one Spanish guy right there, right?
Yeah.
But who, can you see on their side also are these Tlaxcalans, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's further evidence of, oh yeah, the Spanish horse is fighting, stomping that person's head. Ouch. Look at arms and legs. That's a gory sight. So this is further evidence that it's in fact a civil war in which the Spanish were on one side of it. Anyway, that's the example of the Cholula massacre. So after leaving Cholula, killing everybody, word got out. So now the Spanish soldiers, this is an image of the Spanish soldiers, Cortez's enslaved African right there, and Cholulans, tens of thousands of them, not just 3 of them, marching to the capital of the Mexica. And once again, here's Doña Marina prominently in the front. So when they get to the city, Montezuma invites them in, the king of the Aztecs, invites the Spanish in to this causeway right here, actually the southern causeway right here, but said, you Tlaxcalans cannot come in, you're our enemy, stay out. So the Tlaxcalans stayed on shore. Way over here, the Spanish rolled all in. Why did Montezuma invite them in? Why didn't he just wipe them out? What do you think? What do you think, Lee? Give it a gander.
I mean, for one thing, the Spanish didn't have a massive force with them, and he probably wasn't particularly threatened.
He didn't feel threatened at all. He's, in his mind's eye, he is the most powerful man in the world, right? He had not been defeated. He's got a huge army. Spanish are coming into our city. The Tlaxcalans are staying out. Montezuma said, what do I have to worry about? There were many in Montezuma's, like Montezuma's Secretary of War, his brother, said, you know what? No, wipe him out, bro. And Montezuma said, no, don't worry about it. Chill out. Let's just invite him in. Right? So internal Mexica dynamics are going on this whole time. But could you imagine when the Spanish cross over the mountains and enter this valley? Remember, the biggest city any of them had seen in Spain, Toledo or Seville, had 20 to 30,000 people in it. They're rolling into a city with 250,000 right there and about 1 million people on the shoreline surrounding it. They were freaking blown away by this. And there's many, many accounts about how the Spanish were awed by it. Here's what soldier Bernal Diaz wrote about it. He said, when we saw all those cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land and then straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. These great towns and temples and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never seen, things never heard of, seen, or dreamt before. Right? That would be crazy. All right, so November 1519, Cortez and Montezuma meet. This is a very inaccurate representation of their meeting, but I'll leave it at that. Here is Cortez, Montezuma, and Doña Marina right there. No matter how inaccurate, it is accurate that Montezuma would not touch the ground. So here he is. One of his people are putting a piece of cloth on the ground so he wouldn't have to dirty his feet on the ground. And they invited Spanish into the city. The Spanish were nervous. They kept their armor on all the time. They kept their swords at the ready because they just didn't know what they were getting into. However, by all accounts, they were fed well. They were even able to tour the Aztec market. Let me see a raise of hand. Has anybody started the Jeffrey Pilcher book about the people of corn? The first reading? Jeffrey Pilcher. Rachel's eyebrows are telling me no. They're going like that. Emma and Justin, have you, or Monique, or Lee, have you all started the reading yet?
Nope, I have not.
Okay, start it because it's going to take you on a tour of the Mexican public market, and it's just an incredible chapter. I hope you enjoy it. So Cortez returns to Cuba to deal with some political stuff in Cuba. Cuba is the main hub of Spanish Caribbean politics and everything. So the Spanish enjoy Mexica hospitality. They're having huitzilopochtli tacos. I'm sorry, yummy tacos. They're having good dog tacos, salsa, right? All that good aguacates. They're enjoying it. However, when Cortez is away, the leader of the Spanish forces, Alvarado, is a little more trigger happy than Cortez. There were a few guns. And at the feast of Huitzilopochtli, he's the main god. In May of 1520, there's celebrations in this part of the world in Central America, celebrating the coming of the rain. June is the beginning of the rainy season. So in May 1520, they're celebrating, hey, the long dry summer's almost over. We're going to get ourselves some rain. However, at this big gathering of the Aztec elite, right? You had Aztec priests, Aztec political leaders and their families. The Spanish massacre about 85% of the Aztec elite. And it was just a horrific massacre on unarmed people. May, a month and a half later, the Mexica Empire strikes back. Remember, the Spanish are vastly outnumbered in the area, in the city. So in July 1520, the Mexica Empire strikes back, kill a bunch of the Spaniards, force them out. Many of the Spanish, as they were fleeing the city, actually drowned in the shallow water because they had filled their pockets so full of gold. And about, I think 15 years ago now, a water archaeologist found the drowned body of an Aztec soldier, still with armor on, still with gold in his pockets. So the Spanish have been ousted in July 1520. However, what stayed behind in the big, densely populated capital?
Smallpox.
Smallpox, right? Diseases, right? Microorganisms that kill. This is an example of the Columbian Exchange. Your book is gonna, the Jeffrey Pilcher chapter is gonna talk quite a bit about the Columbian Exchange. And it's simply the exchange of goods, right, that evolved in different ways after 10,000 years of human intervention and genetically modifying things. For example, this is the first time Europeans, Asians, and Africans are going to taste corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, turkeys, chocolate, vanilla, avocados. All these goods are going this way. Tobacco, there was no tobacco in Europe till then. Cacao, here's chocolate, vanilla. And can you read all these small little letters down there? Is that legible to you? What strikes you about some of the things that went from Europe, Asia, and Africa over here? Monique, list a couple of the things that strike you about the goods that went to the Americas.
Well, it looks like there's a lot of, like there's some fruits and vegetables, a couple livestock, and a lot of disease.
A lot of disease.
Disease list is definitely the longest list.
Yeah. And we could make these lists longer too, but this is the first time cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses and big dogs are coming to the Americas. The first time coffee and sugar and honeybees. Most of the honeybees that are out there pollinating my garden right now are European. There's a few tiny native ones, but the big European honeybee is going to come. So the aspect of it I'm going to focus on are all the diseases. Let me make that smaller. This is an Aztec drawing of what happens when the pox hit, the smallpox, right? You die really quick. You get the bubonic plague, means bulbos, little like bubbles, and you get all these pussy bubbles on your body and you die a horrific death within days. Smallpox, typhus, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, yellow fever, all these nasty European and Eurasian diseases that they've been sharing for generations, boom, all in one fell swoop, killed about 90 to 95% of indigenous Americans. And interestingly, about 2 years ago, a study came out that said, you know what? This caused a little ice age in the world. You heard about that?
All the tree, yeah, because all the trees growing back.
Yeah, why did all the trees started to grow back in the Americas?
Because especially on the East Coast, there had been so much deforestation for settlements, for orchards, for farms, that without people to maintain them, the tree growth like exploded. Although from what I've read, also when the Pilgrims came over to America, they had a much easier time than a lot of times that people claim they did, because there were already clearly things cut out for orchards, for roads, things like that. A lot of the work on setting up a civilization had already been done because there was a civilization.
No, you're exactly right. Well done, Lee. Well said. So, oh man, what do I do? So let me go back to what Lee was saying. Let's give you, you're exactly right. When these areas were depopulated or emptied because of disease in North America, in the Amazon basin, people were no longer tending orchards, so the forest came back, right? And when the forest came back, it sucked a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. And when you suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, it's going to cool the world. And the world experienced what folks call a little ice age. And I uploaded an extra credit article if you want to read about it. European colonization of Americans killed so many, it cooled the Earth's climate. Not because there was less people, but because there was less people to tend the orchards and they grew. And Lee was also spot on when he said the Pilgrims had an easier time because landscapes had been cleared by the Wampanoag and others who lived in the eastern United States, but they had died off. They had been emptied.
I've read that 96% of the East Coast population died.
Yeah, it was smallpox, a series of them. Well done. All right. So check that out. In fact, famously, the Thames River in London froze over, and people in London were like, what? This never happens. So here's a painting of them ice skating on the Thames River. The Little Ice Age also caused large-scale famine in Northern Europe. So where do you think many Northern Europeans fled to during this Little Ice Age? Where do they take off? Where are you going to go if you're freezing and famine in Northern Europe in, say, the 1600s? Take a guess. Where's the land of opportunity?
Probably near the Mediterranean, just further south, where we'd have a warmer climate.
America. They come to America.
Oh.
Right? Yeah. Mediterranean too, but this actually inspired many folks in Northern Europe to get the heck out and go to the Americas. Interesting, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Good guess, though. I'm sure some of them went to Cyprus or Greece or something like that. So similar to the Wampanoag of the Massachusetts colony having a severe population drop when smallpox hit them in right before the Pilgrims landed, actually. The smallpox devastated central Mexico. In central Mexico, we estimate about 5 to 8 million people died in a 3 to 4 month period. I don't care how you count it. This is one of the most intense death rates in the 3 to 4 month period in human history. Okay, huge, massive death rate, incredible. I told you I love the calendar art. Here's the calendar, 1950s calendar art of Cuauhtemoc, the fallen eagle, the last Mexica emperor right here. More on Cuauhtemoc in the lecture I'm gonna record today and then post it later on. This massive church in Oaxaca was built in the 1550s before the population fell. So it's interesting, I went to visit it, 10 years ago now. It's a massive church in an area where hardly anybody lives. Well, when they built the church, there was a lot of Mexicans who lived around there, but the smallpox hit it so hard, it's a ghost town now. Even to this day, this part of Oaxaca. So this massive church is an evidence of the massive depopulation of this area. There's an Aztec poem that I won't read because of time, but just look at this last part. This is capturing the loss of that many Mexica experience. We have chewed dry twigs and salt grasses. We have filled our mouths with dust and bits of adobe. We have eaten lizards, rats, and worms. When we had meat, we ate it almost raw. In other words, the Aztecs were experiencing very, very hard times in the early 1500s. This poem was written in 1523. That's just a couple years after the smallpox hit. Let me ask you a question now because I'm tired of hearing myself talk. What big Mexican celebration do we still kind of celebrate today? What do you think? Any old guesses? Or what's a cool, popular Mexican celebration?
Dia de los Muertos.
Yeah, Dias de los Muertos. And what does that mean to you, Rachel?
I know it means Day of the Dead, but it's similar to Halloween. I grew up Catholic, so I know kind of a Catholic background for it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's in Spanish, it's Dias de los Muertos, days, because the Mexicans don't celebrate anything in one day. No way. Weddings
3
are 3
days.
days long. Everything's like multiple days, right? It's not like Day of the Dead. I'm teasing you, Rachel, but you know what I'm getting at. Exactly, and historians trace, in part, Mexican celebration of Days of the Dead to this massive loss in the 1500s, right? Commemorating the massive loss. How do you deal with it for those who survive? Well, this is an image from Oaxaca, Mexico I took in 10 years ago or so. right? The Days of the Dead. You go to the cemetery, you light a candle at your loved one's grave or whomever you choose. You tell stories about that loved one. Here's an altar for one who has passed. You put pictures up of the loved ones. When we do our altar at the end of October, we put up an image of my dad, and he liked to drink Pepsi, so we get a little Pepsi bottle, right? Just a little commemorative things that remind us of folks who have passed. Similarly, Mary's Gold. Mary's Gold, you know these flowers, these little cool orange ones that are actually really good in your garden because they keep pests away too. So if you're going to grow a complementary garden, plant some marigolds. They keep the pests away. In Spanish, they're called Flor de Muerto, flower of death, and they're put around on Days of the Dead all over, especially southern Mexican cemeteries. All right, there's your little Day of the Dead information. So back to the conquest or the invasion. In August 1521, Cortez returns. The Spanish and the Tlaxcalans now invade. This is a waterborne invasion. You see them on the boats, right? A waterborne invasion, kind of like D-Day in France. And they come in and they enter a decimated city, right? A city that's in the process of just suffering from smallpox, etc. They come in, conquer the city, and that's where I'm going to leave it here, except for, once again, my question to you, what strikes you about the life of Malintzin and of Doña Marina? Let me finish out her life real quick. Years later, after the conquest of the Aztec capital, Doña Marina actually went to visit her family, right? And now she's a powerful person. Cortez did not marry her, but he did take care of her and granted her a residence. How sweet he is, right? She earned it. She had her own residence outside Mexico City, her own people, right? She was a person of power during her lifetime. She went back to her mom's house and met up with her family. What do you think, how do you think that exchange went between Doña Marina and her family? This is where I'm picking on you all now. What do you think, Lee or Emma or Rachel? It's okay, Monique, I can tell you're chatting with one of your office mates, right? We all have office mates, right, in this new. What do you think happened, Lee, between Doña Marina and her family who sold her into slavery?
It probably wasn't a great exchange on either of their sides.
Good guess. Again, I set you up. That's mean of me. You know what she did? She forgave him. She forgave him, right? And ended up leaving a rather long, I don't want to say happy life, because she was gifted to Cortez, right? But she ended up raising her son Martin, their son Martin. Was she a traitor to her people like many historians and many Mexicans see? Was she a heroine, right? A hero of the invasion? Or do you think she was something else? And I ask you this as you look at this 1930s mural. This is a huge mural painted in a downtown colonial building in Mexico City by Jose Clemente Orozco, picturing Cortez and Malintzin right here. What do you think, Emma? Was she a traitor, heroine, or something else?
I kind of think that in a way she's a victim because she's being enslaved, and all of her life she kind of just has to do what Cortez says. I mean, she does some good things and some bad things, and I mean, maybe Cortez was nice to her at some point, but she wasn't able to choose like her own path in life. So I feel like it wasn't up to her. Like, she had no choice.
I mean, I think she started out as one, but I think I'd need more context for what she actually did with her power once she actually got it. Because you can start out as like in a really rough situation and still end up causing like a serious.
All right, I like it. Monique, what's your take?
I have kind of the same take as Emma. I think she was definitely a victim from the very beginning because she's sold to these, or she's actually just given to these strange people that she doesn't know. She's forced into an unknown situation, and then what choice does she really have but to be the interpreter for them?
Yeah. Right? What is she going to do? Run away, get caught, and get killed? Yeah, she has very few choices. What's your take, Rachel?
I see her kind of like a survivor, kind of just taking each situation and adjusting and moving and growing with them. And she does kind of feel less like a victim as she moves forward in her life and gains power. But I don't know if anyone could really blame her for taking advantage of the situation she was thrown into.
Right? I hear you. And I take Justin, you want to chime in a bit? I know we lost you for a bit, and I'm glad you're back.
I'm sure. I mean, I agree with the survivor thing more. I mean, obviously she was a victim, but she didn't just try to be a victim like throughout her entire life, obviously, because she was always depicted in a way where she was important. So clearly, like what she thought or her influence was valued. So I mean, I agree with the survivor part, and really, like she just took the situation she had and made the most of it. I mean, she wasn't really a traitor. I mean, she kind of was, but at the same time, I mean, what is she supposed to do? I mean, she came from a society that sold her into slavery. I mean, how much of a traitor can she be? I mean, if you're trading against that, what's wrong with it?
Yeah, great input, all y'all. Many Mexicans, in a way to explain the conquest of their big Mexica empire, looked at her as a traitor, right? And she became known as La Chingada or Malintzin. Or what word did you know her by, Lee? Malinche.
Malinche.
Those are all bad. Malinche and La Chingada is a bad word. La Chingada is the Mexican equivalent of the F word. And now when I say the F word, not flexibility, not our class's F word, but that other one, that Germanic one syllable powerful word we use. So she was called La Chingada. And again, don't say this to a Spanish speaker. It's a very bad thing to call somebody. But this is how she's portrayed, as she was the traitor to the Mexica people who allowed big bad Spaniards to come in and conquer poor innocent Mexica people. Of course, the reality is much, much different. And she began to be reimagined after the Mexican Revolution of the 19 teens and 20s. Here is an artist who is heavily influenced by Frida Kahlo. He was actually part of the Frida Kahlo school where she taught out of her blue house. More on Frida Kahlo later. And this painting is called The Dream of Malinche in 1939, giving her a rather respectful perspective, her just dreaming, and here's a Mexican town. I don't want to read too much into an artist painting. That's why they're called art. If you want more about Malinche, I have this book on my shelf, and I can snail mail it to you or somehow get it to you. Camila Townsend wrote a brilliant biography about Malintzin, an Indian woman and the conquest of Mexico. And her basic take is what you all said. What was her choice? She was making the best of what she had. She was a survivor. She was resilient. Later on, she did forgive her family for giving her up. So she's also in that, the best of the Christian tradition, being offering forgiveness, right? She's forgiving. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording because if it goes too long, it's just crazy, but I'll stay on with you all. Bye-bye, recording people.